Okay, right now, at this point in the program, I'd like to bring up Harry Orr. Harry is a PhD. James Snyder and Bob Allison Ataxia Chair in Translational Research. Try to say that. That's a mouthful. He is a professor, Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology Director for the Institute for Translational Neuroscience. Welcome to you, Harry Orr.
Would also like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Chip Wilmot. His real name is George, but everybody calls him Chip. Everybody calls me Harry. For those of you who don't know Chip, he is a ataxia physician scientist, and that means he has both research as well as patient care responsibilities to his job, if you will, at Emory University in Atlanta. So you have somebody on the stage from about as far north as you can get in the at least continental United States, as well as somebody from the south. What we have decided to do is to try to give you a perspective of the different worlds of basic research versus clinical research. I don't know if there's time for questions, but if you have something, stand up, throw something up here, get our attention in any way you can, and we will try to answer your questions. But we have a little, sort of a skit, maybe, going back and forth here. And so we're going to start with Chip.
So I think Sue, we started doing in the Ataxia investigators meeting, and Sue Hagen's putting that together from NAF, and thought that we, knock down, drag out fight of basic science versus clinical research is what we ought to do. So we were trying on boxing gloves and stuff like that, and just decided it wasn't really for us. So, because both things are important, right? Both basic science and clinical research, very, very important. But it gets a little confusing to people who are not necessarily in the field. So we want to make sure that you understand, the definitions and the limitations of each and everything. So I'm going to just explain clinical research for a second. When we say you can participate in a clinical research study, what do we mean by that? And the bottom line is it involves human beings. So clinical research is human studies. That can be divided up into a couple of different categories. People like to think of research as being a treatment trial. We've got an agent that's going to make you better, maybe, and we need to study it. And so a treatment trial is one of the types of clinical research, but there are other kinds of clinical research that need to come before that. There are research studies where we just try to understand the disease. Those are called natural history studies. What we do is we say, ooh, you have this kind of ataxia, SCA1, anti-GAD-mediated ataxia, whatever, and we are going to study you. And we're going to try to apply a certain protocol of what we're looking at, doing MRIs maybe, taking blood maybe, doing spinal taps maybe, examining you, and learn more about the disease from that. So natural history studies are very, very important. Sometimes we just want to understand, like, what's an ataxic movement? What happens with the body with that? And so we might not really be doing a natural history study where we do it over time to find out how things change, but we might just measure some kind of behavior. So those are all kinds of clinical research. Not all clinical research are treatment trials, but we're moving more in this field towards those treatment trials, and that's really exciting.
Okay, so basic research. That's typically in a lab with a bunch of test tubes and machines and stuff like this. It typically does not involve patient or human material patients or humans directly. It sometimes can involve material that we may obtain from patients as well as their siblings and other family members. For example, I think some of you probably have heard about induced pluripotent stem cells, or IPS, where you donate skin fibroblasts or blood cells, and then we go and generate neurons from those in the lab and use those to perform basic studies. In basic science, a good basic scientist is developing a specific question about the disease and then applying a model system to try to understand that question, get an answer to that question. What is the function of the protein affected in a particular form of ataxia, for example? What does it do in the cell? And the sort of general idea is that, first of all, basic research expands our knowledge about biology, but more importantly, it begins to set the stage for the next type of research that basic scientists do, and that is preclinical studies. In this case, we're using a research model to address the question that would be directly applicable to a clinical study or clinical trial. And we're testing it out first in a model system to get a better understanding of efficacy, as well as perhaps some potential side effects that we need to be aware of as we move towards clinical trials. Now, just sort of a side note from our sort of planned schedule. Planned is a really overstatement of what Chip and I did. But anyway, historically, certainly in the ataxias, historically, basic scientists and clinical scientists were kind of moving down two separate tracks and didn't interact very much. But as successes have moved forward, both from the clinical standpoint and understanding the clinical aspects of the ataxias, as well as from the basic science standpoint, we're starting to interact more and more. And one of the major responsibilities of colleagues of mine like Chip is to keep me on the straight and narrow as a basic scientist, that I don't wander off too far into something that is perhaps interesting to me as a scientist, but is not going to tell us that much more about how to deal with the ataxia as a disease. And the meeting, for example, we just came from, we have spent a fair amount of the meeting discussing issues about how can the basic science that we've done on the ataxias help us develop better strategies for clinical trials, and vice versa. How can the clinical research help us basic scientists develop better models and better research questions in the lab to better understand the disease? And so from a research standpoint, this is a very this is a very exciting time. We're on the brink of moving some therapies that we think to clinical trials for some of the forms of ataxia that could have a substantial impact on the patient's handling of the disease. And so it's keep in touch, as they say. Hopefully in the next couple of meetings we'll actually be talking to you about some successful clinical trials.
So the way that clinical science and basic science differ also needs to be talked about. You know, in most populations, humans aren't inbred. There's a few areas in the country maybe they are, but that's a joke that I shouldn't say. So, which is kind of unlike some animal models, and Harry can tell you about the basic science thing. But so we are always having to deal with heterogeneity. Just means variability amongst people. And variability, just as a basic mathematical, statistical consideration, always makes it more difficult to prove your point because of the way statistics work. If you always see the number 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and you're expecting a series, the next thing that's probably going to come up is a 1. If you have 1, 2, 3, 7, 17, 71, 73, you can't predict what's going to happen. So that uncertainty makes you unable to predict things as well. And that's more of a problem in the clinical sphere. So we have to kind of deal with that. We have to deal with that by taking things from basic science that have pretty large effects. If it's having a super small effect in the basic science field, and now we're going to add a bunch of variability that exists in humans but not necessarily lab animals, it's going to make it harder to find an effect. So that's one thing we have to take into account. You know, one of the other limitations of basic science is we can't do everything on humans, right? There's codes of ethics and behavior and everything. And sometimes patients are willing to volunteer. I'll be a guinea pig for anything because I just want to help. It's actually like against the law to do certain things that you would think you ought to have the autonomy to volunteer for. Actually, you can't. Even if you want to do it, sign away all your rights and permissions, it still can't be done. There are rules and regulations about these things. So we have to be careful about what can be done in terms of safety and the population that's studied, et cetera. And then all of that brings into account the limitation of cost. All research is expensive, basic science and clinical science. But to do a clinical study where we need enough volunteers to counteract that heterogeneity problem, sometimes it runs into, for just a single clinical trial, for instance, tens of millions of dollars. And that, you know, I don't have that in my back pocket. You know, you guys don't have it either, I would expect. NAF doesn't have that for a big clinical study. They can support other clinical studies. But so we're reliant on partnering with drug companies. And they have the money, and they are moving into our field, which is really, really exciting. They're starting to do things to bring treatments and organize the trials and pay for them, and that's necessary. If we find something, it might end up that drug costs a fair amount of money, and the drug company is charging more than what maybe some people think they should, but that is the system that we work in. And it has pluses and minuses, but one of the pluses is we would not do the trial, we would not find the treatment if they didn't fund it and organize it and help run it anyway. So for the treatment trial side of it, it can be very expensive, and we need to partner with industry to bring those things forward.
So, basic research, for the most part, is funded by the National Institutes of Health, i.e. our tax dollars. So as we're approaching April 17th, don't think all of your tax dollars are going to be flushed down some federal toilet. I would like to argue and let you know that the NIH and the way it disseminates the dollars that it has in its budget for research is one aspect of the federal government that works fairly well. It works as well as I think any sort of bureaucratic entity populated by human beings can work. So I, as a basic scientist, get an idea for a research program. I submit an application to the National Institutes of Health. They have specific due dates. It goes to what is called a study section for review and evaluation and rating. A study section is populated by my peers, other scientists, and they go through the application and give it a score, a numerical rating, and that score is then put together with all the other applications that study section has seen over several meetings, and it's given what's called a percentile. At this time, for NINDS, which is the National Institutes of Neurological Disease and Stroke, which is the major funding of ataxia research, the pay line is the 12th percentile. So that means the application has to be in the top 12%. So my math is right, 88% of the applications are not funded. So the competition is very stiff, and that is reflected largely because of the relative size of the NIH budget to the number of investigators who are out there applying for research grants. I think the Ataxia investigators have done a really good job. I mean, I think Ataxia is well represented by funded NIH grants, and I think to a large extent that reflects a lot of what the National Ataxia Foundation has done, as well as your efforts to put Ataxia in front of investigators so they become excited about the possibility of doing ataxia research. And so you all should be congratulated for that. In addition to the sort of basic research grants, NIH also has a mechanism for the translational research or the preclinical studies that we talked about earlier. So I have an idea for a particular line of investigation that may impact on how physicians may treat ataxia patients, and I submit that application, and that gets reviewed in a very similar process. So NIH is supportive of both basic as well as these preclinical or translational studies. It very much has in mind sort of two important goals. One is the firm belief that the more we understand about the basic biology of the nervous system, the more we'll understand what's going wrong in diseases like ataxia. And second of all, a funding mechanism to take those advances in basic research and move them towards something that will be beneficial in the clinic. And finally, although pharma is the major funder of clinical trials, there are programs by which we can apply to NIH for some funds to support clinical trials themselves. But that is, I complain about how expensive it is for me to keep all the mice I have. You wouldn't believe how well cared for these mice are and how much it costs to keep them. I could stay at the Marriott for quite a while on my lab's budget for animal care is $100,000 a year. So it costs, and that is the way it is. Nothing's more expensive than it should be, but it's just a very expensive endeavor, and it just escalates as you move towards clinical research and clinical trials. I don't think I have anything else to say. Do you have anything?
Yeah.
Okay. Chip always has something more to say.
Harry brought up that NIH funds some clinical studies, clinical trials. It's not just all pharma-based. It's absolutely true. And in fact, but it's only special things they would fund. One of those things actually, and it's very competitive to try to do this, but suppose that we're always asked, should I take nicotinamide? What about vitamin D or something along those lines? And there's something that not all patients understand, but because it is still, money drives a lot of things, and again, that has good things and bad things associated with it. But one of the issues is that if there isn't intellectual protection from the agent that would be tested, then a company is not going to invest in it. There's not going to be a company that's going to do a vitamin D trial in ataxia, let's say, because vitamin D is freely available to everybody. They are not going to be able to recoup any of their money by selling vitamin D and having it approved for ataxia. So that everything that's available at GNC, essentially, supplements, really require funding through NIH kinds of mechanisms. It's very uncommon. There's occasionally, companies will have a special formulation that they think they can get patent protection on. But so those types of studies are pretty much done, have to be done through NIH or similar studies. The other thing that I wanted to bring up for clinical, and I don't know if you'll have a follow-up for that with maybe your work, but Harry kind of brought up that basic and clinical science are interacting so much more now, which is wonderful and is very true. The other thing is just the networking that's required even within the field, so that clinical research can be done at one site, but one of the reasons it's expensive is that we tend to need more subjects, and it's a rare enough disease that we have to have multiple sites. So one of the big things that happens in the clinical field is we have consortia. Consortium right now, we have the CRC-SCA is what it's called, Clinical Research Consortium in Spinocerebellar Ataxia, that is collecting data on patients. But not only collecting patients on data in a defined study that has NAF support, thankfully, and is very, very important, but also we work together. We're just a natural, group of people who go have a beer at an NAF meeting and talk about, a new idea for a new study. And that's the way it needs to work. Basic science, there have been collaborations in basic science in the ataxia field that Harry's been a part of that have been huge and advanced the field greatly. I don't know if you want to mention anything with Huda. But it's that kind of working together is critical in both fields. And NAF is really an excellent facilitator for that working together.
Yeah, I think that's I see the clock ticking down here. I think that's a great point to emphasize in closing, is the National Ataxia Foundation over the years has been, just a real important entity in bringing us together and reminding us of what the goal is ahead of us. It's not necessarily the improvement of my career, although that's not a bad idea, but there is a bigger goal out there, and I think that for example, the ataxia investigators meetings, one of our major objective is to bring in young investigators and have them come in contact with people like yourselves, patients with ataxia and families dealing with ataxia, so that they understand the human aspects of the disease. And so it really helps getting these young investigators committed to a career in ataxia research. And I think the important point I want to close with is that there are a lot of really outstanding, really bright young people, kids, young investigators coming along who are committed to research careers both in basic as well as clinical in the area of ataxia. So you should feel very secure in that the future of ataxia research is not dependent on the old guys like ourselves here. It will keep going even when we're no longer participants. And lastly, I just want to thank you all for your support of NAF, your support of research, and being there when somebody's asked to draw some blood or whatever. It's a terrific community to be part of.